And welcome to Iranian Studies Initiative's first program of fall semester 2021. My name is Yas Alizadeh, and I'm a faculty member here at NYU. And on behalf of Ali Mirsapasi, the director of ISI, and other committee members, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to our program today. Much gratitude, of course, goes to Kevorkian for sponsoring this program, and specifically to Jim Ryan for being the digital backbone of all of our sessions at ISI. Let me also announce our two upcoming sessions. One is on October 14th, and the title is The Long 1970s, Iran's Radical Movements and Its Global Connections. Moderator and discussant will be Aran Keshavarzian. And the third and last program of ISI this fall will be on November 4th. It's called Writing Capitalism into the History of Iran, and the moderator and discussant will be Vital Mousavi. I would like to welcome our three panelists, amazing scholars in the field of Persian, Iranian, and Middle Eastern studies, Amir Mousavi, Neda Boluchi, and Sheda Dayani. Welcome. So this is how we're going to do it today. I will begin by introducing a brief introduction of our panelists, and I will give a short overview of the book that we are here to hear about, Losing Our Minds Coming to Our Senses, Sensory Readings of Persian Literature and Culture. And then after my brief introduction, our panelists will speak, and we will then open the floor to audience's questions. You can actually put your questions in the chat if you like. So Amir Mousavi, our first speaker, is the co-editor of Losing Our Minds Coming to Our Senses, who along with Mehdi Khorrami, NYU professor emeritus, basically created this breakthrough book. Amir is an assistant professor in the Department of English at Rutgers University in Newark. He received his PhD here at Middle East and Islamic Studies, NYU. His research and teaching interests are in modern Arabic and Persian literatures and the cultural histories of Iran, Iraq, and the Levant. His publications have appeared in many places, including Aleph, Middle East Critique, International Journal of Middle East Studies, and Iran Namak. Amir is currently completing a book called Dust That Never Settled, Afterlives of Iran-Iraq War in Arabic and Persian Literatures. The book is sponsored by National Endowment for Humanities and American Council of Learned Societies, and it is the result of his vast interest in cultural memory and the representation of violent past. Dr. Mousavi's chapter in this book that we are covering today is Sonic Triggers and Fiery Pools, the Senses at War in Hossein Mortazayan Alpinar's Scorpion. Neda Boluchi is our second speaker. She is the Associate Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Rutgers, New Brunswick, where she teaches on the modern Middle East. Neda's forthcoming book examines the transformative discourse on Iran as sacred across political and religious spectra. Her work has appeared in the Journal of American Academy of Religion, European Journal of Jewish Studies, among others, Anthropos and Iranian Studies Journal. Neda has forthcoming articles also on Iranian Jewry during the Iran-Iraq War, as well as on Fida and Fidayin. Her work has been sponsored by multiple Mellon Foundation fellowships. Her chapter in this book is called Seeing Red, Hearing the Revolution, the Multi-Sensory Appeal of Shur. Finally, we welcome Sheda Dayani, who is a theater historian of 19th and 20th century Iran. Sheda's research utilizes theatrical documents as historical sources and examines the development of Iranian theater. Sheda has recently done fieldwork in Iranian cities and villages for her upcoming book titled Making History with Theater in Modern Iran, Juggling Revolutionary. Sheda is a postdoctoral research associate at the Mosabbar Rahmani Center at Princeton University, has been the preceptor at Harvard University before. She also got her PhD here at Middle Eastern Studies at NYU. Sheda's award-winning poetry has been featured on NPR and her intriguing chapter in the book that we are discussing today is called Taziyeh and Social Jouissance Beyond the Pleasure of Pain in the Islamic Passion Play and Muharram Ceremonies. Welcome, everyone. Losing Our Minds, Coming to Our Senses, Sensory Readings of Persian Literature and Culture is a collection of 9 chapters that focus on the sensorially rich Persian literary and cultural productions. A diverse set of essays that approach the topic of sense and sensoria, not only in various genres, but also from very different perspectives. The chapters are beautifully interconnected and intertwined, so much so that there is an intertextuality that is fully visible and pleasing while read. The book also reads like an anthology that Persian critical theory truly needed. A sensory overview of Persian cultural productions, including fiction, nonfiction, film, newspaper, poetry, and rituals. The book in effect questions, if not shatters, the strict and tunneled vision of socio-political theory that has for long engulfed Persian poetics. It offers an alternative to the politicized discourses that have not only been normative, but growing even more so by every political hiccup in Iran of 20th and 21st centuries. The onset of post-colonial theory in literature took a decisive turn in the way Middle Eastern and specifically Persian cultural productions were interpreted, critiqued, and valued. In the introduction of the book, Michael Beard says, quote, "It is odd that we would have to defend sensory world, but we have the ability to ignore it," end quote. I would add that it is very common that post-colonial scholars of the literature and culture of the Middle East, and specifically Iran, have been expected to let go of the body and the sensorial in our literary criticism, and instead wear political, historical, sociological, anthropological glasses to examine Iran's cultural productions, dissecting them to find meaning that is expected to be metaphysical, ethereal, abstract, collective, universal, meaning that has already been defined actually in a critical theory handbook. And we kind of normatively are expected to squeeze our poetic lines, our fictional characters, our Persian tapestry into them. In his chapter, Amir Musavi takes us back to the bloody, hallucinatory, slow motion, scary moments of the ending days of Iran-Iraq war, to the train station in Andimeshk, that in-between place that seems to be repeating in the narrator's memory, and the sensescape that is very overpowering. It is as if we can smell the blood that is dripping from the truck driver's face or is oozing through the steps on the train. It is the smell of the same crimson blood that takes us to Neda Baluchi's chapter, which gives us such an intense visual experience of Amir Mukhtar Karimpour's 1951 multi-sensory newspaper, Shuresh, a newspaper that called on its readers, literate and illiterate, to rise up and Shuresh against the Shah. The red screen in the pictures of Shuresh leads us to Shehda Dayani's analysis of the pleasure of pain in the Shiite ritual of mourning and wailing and Shura Hosseini, where the colors, sounds, and kinetics of Muharram powerfully enwrap the performers and the audiences in an ecstatic status of communal trauma and sore sublimity. There is a fluid intertextuality in this book that is itself very pleasing to trace, a sensory pleasure in itself. It is as if the editors followed the Persian poetry communal recitation game Mushaire, where one person recites a line of poetry and the last letter of the line is the prompt for another person to follow up with a poetic line. But perhaps it is Mehdi Khorrami who in chapter 1 declares that the gloves are off. He invites us to take a glass of wine with Hafiz, move to the beat of his rhythm, and let the poet be as earthly as any one of us in a Persian party. Khorrami seems to assert that Persian literature has had enough of our political interpretations that seems to take the five senses out of the equation of making sense. A similar trope, which in his reading of Poniru Rabanipur's Shaphay Shurangiz, These Crazy Nights, Anum Parvar picks up to bring the reader back to earthly experiences, if you will, to the scent of the nights of Shiraz, to the echoes of the wailings of hospitalized veterans of Iran-Iraq War, and finally to the taste of the cold and sweet ice cream licked in the freedom of a Las Vegas strip. Losing our minds, coming to our senses presents a collective appreciation of cultural cues and the pedagogy to read texts as a multi-sensorial experience. The book brings Persian cultural literary productions down to earth and materializes them. It carves a space for reading, for pleasure, and for the sensory denomination of literature and culture. The book reminds us that Persian literature has been levitated far too long and needs to reclaim its body to come back to life as it only makes sense. Now I'm going to ask Amir to start his presentation, and then from then on we'll have Nida and then Shada following.
Great. Thank you, Yas, for that very kind introduction. Just before we begin, I just want to thank Ali Mirsapasi and Saad Soleimani of the NYU Iranian Studies Initiative, as well as the staff of the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies for sponsoring this event. And of course, to my wonderful co-panelists who each contributed chapters to the edited volume that we're going to speak about today. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is first add a little bit more to Yas's introduction by talking about how losing our minds, coming to our senses, sensory readings in Persian literature and culture took shape, and then speak a little bit about my own chapter in the volume dealing with Hossein Abkanar's well-known short novel with a very long title. Let me just get the screen shared over here. Okay. Can we see that?
Yes.
Yes, okay. The idea for this volume emerged from my co-editor, Mehdi Khorami, who unfortunately was unable to join us today, and his ongoing research project on the senses in Persian literature. In recent years, he organized 2 conference panels around the idea of sensory studies in Persian literature. The first of these took place at the Association for Iranian Studies Conference in Vienna in 2016, and the second at the World Congress for Middle Eastern Studies in Seville in 2018. The panels were prompted by a few questions, spurred on obviously by what's been called the sensory turn in the humanities and social sciences, and particularly within anthropology. Being based in literary studies, however, our questions naturally went in that direction and prompted us to ask a fairly basic question, which was, how are the 5 traditional senses represented in Persian literature, inclusive of fiction, poetry, theater, and so on? The papers in that initial panel led to perhaps more important questions, such as could sensory studies inspire new approaches to Persian literary and cultural texts? And critically, might it offer an interesting way to break free from the dominance of socio-political approaches to Persian language cultural production? So those of you who are familiar with broader trends within Iranian studies and Persian literary studies will know that both sociological approaches on the one hand and the search for political allegory on the other form no small part of both popular criticism as well as the academic study of Persian language cultural production. Perhaps nowhere is this more prevalent than in the study of modern Persian literature. So with these questions in mind and the feedback that we received from the panels, we asked our contributors to use this anthropologically inspired sensory turn to approach their topics and texts. The volume's chapters demonstrate that close attention paid to the senses, the very thing that we so often look past, as Michael Beard eloquently states in his introduction, reveal a rich world of sensory experiences that both coexist with and help constitute other meaning-making elements on which we, as critics, are trained to focus. The result, I believe, is an interesting and diverse array of approaches to literature, media, theater, and film that demonstrate some of the directions that we believe sensory studies might go in relation to Persian literature and culture. And you can see from the table of contents what I mean. Hopefully you can see that. Let me. The chapters offer a wide range of approaches and topics, whose lack of a singular theoretical glue, so to speak, warmly nod toward the exploratory and introductory nature of this approach. The volume crosses the classical and modern eras of literature and culture and offer a taste of what sensory studies might allow us to do when applied to different forms of cultural production. As the editors, we hope that this volume, along with some of the recent work by scholars working in history and literature, people like Catherine Babayan or Domenico Ingenito, and recent translations into Persian of foundational texts in sensory studies, can all be a modest first step in introducing the field to the study of Persian language cultural production. So with that in mind, I'd like to switch gears now away from one of the volume's editors and speak for a few moments as one of its contributors. My own chapter, titled Sonic Triggers and Fiery Pools, The Senses at War in Hossein Mortazayan Abkenar's Scorpion, takes sensory studies in the direction of my main research project, dealing with the culture and especially the literature of the Iran-Iraq War. As you probably already know, the war between the two countries lasted nearly a decade, from 1980 to 1988, and resulted in hundreds of thousands of dead between the two countries. It's been the subject of numerous scholarly studies, as well as works of literature, film, and journalistic reporting. While many of these works have engaged with the politics of the war and its aftermath, or the representation of the war and its consequences from a variety of angles, the sensory experience of this war, at least to my knowledge, remains an unexplored area of inquiry. Personally, I found this rather shocking, even though war, and in particular this war and the way it was waged, for reasons which I'll mention later, was perhaps the most sensorially overwhelming experience in the lives of many it affected. The range of literary texts, from oral histories and memoirs to fiction, poetry, and film, make that point very clear. The 8-year war with Iraq was formative for some, catastrophic for many, and has seared sensorially intense experiences into the minds and bodies of countless soldiers and citizens whom it affected. The chapter I wrote specifically deals with acclaimed writer Hossein Mortazayan Abkenar's short experimental novel with a 2-part title. In Persian, it's Aqrab ruye pellehay rahan an Dimeshq ya az Qatar khun micheke qurban. The English translation is a scorpion on the steps of the Dimeshq Railroad, or there's blood dripping from this train, sir. The slim book, and you can see the cover here, the original cover at least, was first published in Iran by Nate Publishing House in 2006 and received both the Golshiri Foundation and Mehragan Awards for the Best Novel of the Year, as well as the Vav Literary Prize for the Most Distinct Novel for that year. It initially received a lot of press in Persian language publications, but was banned by government censors just before its third printing, presumably because of its decidedly negative depiction of the war, the soldiers, and the politicians who fueled the conflict. The novel spares none of them from criticism, and its characterization of soldiers' experiences at the war front, and especially in this case, the protagonist's effort to escape it, are an absolute nightmare. After the novel was banned, Nashr Al Koja, a Paris-based Persian language publisher, began reprinting the novel in 2012. It's since been translated into French, German, Arabic, and Kurdish, and excerpts have been published in English in the UK-based literary journal Consequence. Set in the final days of the Iran-Iraq War, The Scorpion, and I won't mention the entire title every time I say it, focuses on Mortaza Hedayati, a conscripted soldier from Tehran, discharged and attempting to make his way back home from the war front, from the railroad station of the small, war-ravaged southwestern Iranian town of Dimeshq. It's not a combat novel and never describes Iraqi forces or close fighting with them. It's also not one of the many home front stories dealing with the civilian and veteran experiences of the war, but falls somewhere between the two with its depictions of violence that take place near the front during a desperate attempt to flee. Organizationally, the novel's 19 short chapters proceed in a non-linear, at times even circular manner, and don't need to be read in sequential order. Indeed, if one were to read them as standalone vignettes, each chapter could be read as an independent short story. Many of the chapters blend quote-unquote reality with what could be described as moments of hallucinatory or dreamlike states, and indeed, some of them read like terrifying scenes resulting from the soldiers' sleep deprivation and drug use described in the novel. My reading of Upkinar's book examines, of course, the novel's use of the senses, but it really narrows in on the way that sound is employed throughout the novel. I focus especially on the diversity of sounds related to war and their function as triggers for narrative time changes and flashbacks, acting as a thread that ties together the Scorpion's non-chronological and purposely disorganized chapters. The chapter puts forth some ideas of what a quote-unquote sensescape of the war was, particularly as it was reproduced by literary narratives of the conflict. In order to do so, I draw from Constance Classen and David Howe's now foundational work within sensory studies, as well as Martin Dautry, who of course teaches here at NYU's Department of Music, and his more recent concept of the bellophonic. So what do I mean by those things? I, along with the other contributors to the volume, borrow the idea of sensescape from anthropologist David Howes, who defines it as, quote, the idea that the experience of the environment and of the other persons and things which inhabit the environment is produced by a particular mode of distinguishing, valuing, and combining the senses in the culture under study. With that in mind, I contextualize Upkinar's Scorpion within some of the broader contours of the Iranian sensory experience of the war, which was complex, diverse, and contingent upon numerous cultural, political, geographic, and generational factors. Moreover, I frame the frontline and combat experience of the war as a pansensorial assault on those who participated in it. Perhaps nowhere was this clearer than the experience of living and fighting in trenches, a state that upended the sensory impressions of soldiers by inverting night and day and life above and below ground, all while facing enemy fire. Secondly, I read the novel within the current literary ecosystem within which Iranian war literature is produced. This literature, variously described as sacred defense literature, adabiyat difai muqaddas, or more simply as war literature, adabiyat jang, depending on one's view of the conflict. It's no secret that the dominant approach to literature of the Iran-Iraq War revolves almost entirely around the political implications of texts. In the case of this novel, it's led most critics to comment on how the novel is quote-unquote anti-war because of its negative depiction of the war front and the dialogue among soldiers, then mention in passing how the novel is stylistically complex and experimental. What I show, or at least what I hope to have shown, was that the Scorpion's use of the senses is intricately tied up both in the formal complexity as well as in the politics of the novel. I claim that a closer reading of the novel's sensorial elements reveals that it uses them to two major ends. The first of these is the relatively conventional technique of employing the senses to capture the overpowering sensorial assault of the war on the soldiers who fought in it. I'm calling this conventional because it's really how nearly all works of war literature from this war or from countless others employ descriptions of combat. Things like being bombed and fired upon, witnessing injury and death, the sights and smells of the battlefront, and so on. Secondly, and more exceptionally, the novel uses the senses and their purposeful disorientation to convey a unique dystopian view of the entire experience of the Iran-Iraq War. In doing so, it projects an overall sense of cynicism and at times even revulsion with the nearly decade-long war project against Iraq. This second use of the senses is intricately connected to the formal complexity of the novel and is as important to the classification of the novel as anti-war as the actions and speech of the characters. The Scorpion evokes a range of sensory reactions to the conflict within the war's larger sensescape, but it emphasizes the sonic and visual aspects of Mortaza's war experience, often drawing a direct connection between the two by using sound as a trigger for sudden shifts in time and deeper levels of sensory disorientation. In thinking through the sounds of war and the way that they're used in the novel, I found the idea of the quote bellophonic helpful. According to Martin Dautry, who coined the term, the bellophonic refers to the accumulation of sounds that are produced by both weaponry and motorized vehicles associated with all aspects of war. But also, he writes, it encompasses sonic material that's less directly or conventionally associated with warfare. Thus, the bellophonic is the imagined total of sounds that would not have occurred had conflict not taken place. The soundscape to which he refers is post-2003 Iraq, but we can easily take the concept and apply it to the Iranian side of the Iran-Iraq war or to any other conflict situation for that matter. In this case, the war's bellophonic soundscape includes the sound of mortars, machine gun fire, and tanks, but it also encompasses the crunching of empty shells and casings under one's feet, the music and voices of civilian radio reaching warfront soldiers, the sounds of pre-battle chants and hands rhythmically beating chests, the laughter and crying of soldiers before a battle, passing trains carrying living and dead bodies back home to the front, and even the gurgling of a water pipe in the dead of a night in a trench, among so many other things. With all that in mind, and before handing the screen over to Neda and Sheda, I'll provide just one of the several examples I use in the chapter to illustrate my argument. Chapter 9 of The Scorpion opens with a description of Mortaza and 4 members of his brigade digging foxholes. It begins with one of the soldiers, Ali, calling on everyone to take a break for tea. We read, quote, every few minutes we could hear the sound of an explosion. From afar, he and the others could see how mounds of dirt would fly into the air and once again fall to the ground. Now, obviously, the explosions here cause fear. Although they're visually and sonically stunning, the soldiers try to force or maintain a level of normalcy through conversation, drinking tea, and working. This becomes increasingly difficult, though, as the mortars and their sounds come closer, and it becomes clear that the 5 are being targeted. Sound, in this case, the violent sound of artillery shells exploding, triggers an almost synesthetic disorientation of the other senses, activating both sensorial disorder and shifts in narrative time. We read, and this is a long quote, I apologize, I've put it on screen. Mortaza was about to place the kettle back on the fire when its hand suddenly fell off. The kettle fell onto the fire, sending sparks flying into the air and turning the fire into smoke. There was a terrifying boom of an explosion. Everyone hit the ground out of fear. No one opened their eyes until the dirt that soared into the sky came tumbling back down. The blast wave shook his eardrum. The sound of silence filled his head. He lifted his head and saw Siavash lying flat on the ground. He rose and went towards him with his mouth and hands open. He wanted to scream, Sia, but he did. And he did, but no sound came out. Siavash's body faced the ground, and oh, the cloth wrapped around his hand was bloodied, and oh, one of his boots had fallen to his side, and oh. Where are you going, Mortaza? At night, he took a lantern, came out of the trench, and slipped into the foxhole, which Siavash had half dug, going down to his waist. He tilted his head to the sky and looked up at the stars and the non-existent moon that darkened the desert. The sky was clear, but he felt rain drop, 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 hitting his face. The rain intensified, soaking his head and neck. Then the water took off, turning the dirt of the area into mud and pouring into the trench. The flood water was slowly filling the foxhole. The muddy water rose to his cold ankles, to his frozen knees, to his groin, soaking his waist and lower back. Nothing they did could bring him out of the hole. When the brigade leader saw him, he declared, "That's it, leave him." For 5 days and nights, he stayed that way. Each night, the skies poured rain, the ground turned to mud, and he was soaked to his waist. On the 6th night, he fell asleep and dreamed of the pool that caught fire. He opened his eyes and saw the red crescent moon. Now, the sounds of wartime sensory shock depicted here are powerful blasts, and their bloody visual aftermath transport Mortaza to another warfront scenario. The narrative uses freestanding solitary commas to separate 3 distinct but connected moments of his warfront experience: being targeted by enemy mortars, leaving his foxhole in the middle of the night and making his way to Siavesh's foxhole and then refusing to leave it. However, the nightmare of earth and mud of the final moment does not end when he opens his eyes to see the moon. The novel's winding narrative takes readers to a deeper, more chaotic place later in chapter 14, which consists of a single punctuation-free paragraph that presents 3 pages of sensorial assault describing this quote-unquote pool that caught fire, the very pool that we just saw in chapter 9. Narrated in the first person, this scene is the finest example in the novel of how the disorientation of the senses is used to describe the nightmare and utter senselessness of the war front. The images of the chapter flash by in dreamlike waves, and most are described in repetitive sentence fragments that are punctuated by the word math, which here refers to the blurring or disappearance of things and images. The dream's images transform quickly. The chapter opens with a flash of serenity, a description of a crystal clear pool humming with the sounds of women chattering. An explosion followed by screams quickly disturbs any semblance of peace in the water, and the water is muddied by Mortaza's dirty fatigues and boots. The women's bodies then repeatedly are described as white, fleshy, skinny, thrash atop each other, their limbs intermingle, their mouths gasp for air, their hair tangles to form a horrifying black mass. The pool becomes a lurid kaleidoscope of death. For the sake of time, I won't read the entire passage here, but if you're interested, you can check out the volume, and I'm sure your library has it. If not, you can purchase it from Leiden University Press. The nightmare and chapter conclude with someone screaming Mortaza's name. It becomes clear that this scene is connected to the moment when Mortaza falls into the foxhole in chapter 9. In connecting this scene to the earlier one in the flooded foxhole that swallows Mortaza, sound, again, is responsible for triggering the barrage of vivid images that overwhelms him. In this case, it's an explosion, perhaps the same explosion that I referred to a few minutes ago, which may have killed Siavash in chapter 9. So to conclude, the attention to the senses which I bring to my reading of this short novel allows readers to focus less exclusively on the optics and politics of war, dividing literature into simple pro and anti-war camps, as criticism of the literature of the Iran-Iraq War tends to do. Instead, it allows us to grasp the war as a multi-sensory experience that goes beyond the visual to include distinct oral, olfactory, corporal, and gustatory experiences. A reading that's attuned to the senses and the intricate language that they require can offer a refreshing reorientation towards the formal qualities of war fiction. It potentially sheds light on literary techniques missed by strict sociopolitical readings that overlook or only scratch the surface of a text's formal qualities. In this case, a different approach, using insights from sensory studies, not only allows us to better appreciate, at least in my opinion, Abkanar's important, innovative novel, but it also provides tools from which to take a fresh look at a broader body of literature from the Iran-Iraq War. This includes new works that continue to appear and texts from the past 40 years that have been celebrated or attacked based on nothing more than the politics of their content. Coming to our senses, it seems, might allow us to reevaluate and better appreciate the literary and aesthetic power of this significant body of literature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amir. It was wonderful to hear all this, and you did such a great job with the book that I actually went ahead and bought the original Persian novel. But now we're going to give the floor to Neda. Neda, please. Want to start?
Thank you very much, Yes, both for your introduction and the invitation to be here today. I also thank Ali, the Iranian Studies Initiative, and the Kevorkian Center, everyone there. I do want to take a moment and thank everybody in Iran who lobbied for me to get the archive I'm going to be studying and discussing today, actually. It's quite a large archive that has largely been left uncovered. And so before getting into my analysis of Shuresh, I do want to give you a little bit of context to how this article kind of came about. And I think it very aptly gives you an example of the multisensory appeal of Shudesh and the impact of it. Prior to COVID, I was actually, I used to meet quite often with Mehdi Khorami, one of the co-editors, and I was running late one day for what was then a lunch meeting, and I was quite agitated, and he very naturally asked what was happening. I said, oh, I have this horrible, horrible headache. I'm re-examining Shudesh, trying to see where I'm gonna put additional parts into the book manuscript, and all it does is yell, and I have this horrible headache from all of this yelling. And so Mehdi, being Mehdi, he laughed and said, well, maybe don't spend so many hours on it. But from that conversation and my reaction to, again, looking over the archive, came out the chapter that is now in Losing Our Minds and Coming to Our Senses. And so I think it gives you, even on my second reading of it, the extent, the powerful sort of extent of the auditory appeal that this text has and how powerful it is. And so I do want to give you, to be clear about Shudesh. Shudesh is a newspaper that began publication on February 12th, 1951. Amir Karimpour Shirazi published the first issue of the newspaper by inviting the Iranian people to a, quote, bloody riot and revolution. And I come largely from sociocultural anthropology and history. And so as part of that background, I think I'm a bit of an exception in this volume. And Shudesh is largely, if at all, known by his historians. It's usually maybe one or two is in a footnote. And the reason for that is because, one, the archive is very difficult to get a handle on or get a hold of. And then two, it's largely been disregarded for its socio-political text. It's libelous, it's slanderous. In more polite terms, it's considered unprofessional. And so I will address some of those things, but I think in the course of reading Shudesh as this unprofessional publication that should be illegal and was outlawed by the Pahlavi government, it hasn't been given its due within the larger context of political theology. The reason behind the publication very much was this bloody riot and revolution that Karimpour wanted to catalyze. And so what we need to see is that there's more than this political text to it, but how the multisensory appeals are used. And this is so important, I think, particularly in this 1940s and 1950s period, because we do need to recall that of 11 million adults in Iran, only an estimated 121,000 to 176,000 were literate. And so we have a huge population that is semi-literate and illiterate, or what we could otherwise call multiple literacies. And so this appeal that I'm going to discuss of both the sight and sounds of Shudesh is vital to enlarging the consumer population that wouldn't just read Shudesh, but that would see its symbols and hear in what is a shared hearing environment in mid-20th century Iran. And I think that's, again, vitally important in the context of this understudied period and this nearly ignored archive that is Shudesh. And so what I see is not Shudesh exactly as a mere text. It's this powerful material object. And so it delivers on two planes. One, it engages sights and sounds. And two, because of this engagement, it broadens its appeal, increases its consumer base to include all varieties of literacies in Iran. And so to the point of the chapter on this, I think that Karimpour largely achieves these objectives. Since I got this archive, there have been some political and polemical articles about Karimpour by a variety of political parties. But I think all of those really ignore this inherited media tradition that you see in Shudesh, and that is visual arts and combining visual arts with the written text to appeal to the the sense of sight. And so I've mentioned Shudesh's yelling as a text, but first I want to talk more in depth about its appeals to sight. And so the newspaper has multiple ways that it does that. And I'm just going to pull this up really quick. Great images, multiple images on the front page of every issue. And so what's important about this inherited multisensory appeal is not just that there are images, because images could, of course, be in black and white. They could be small. They could be of the elites, right? Political elites, financial elites that wouldn't necessarily interest a broad array and a diverse array of the Iranian populace that Karimpour would be trying to appeal to for riots and revolution. And so thus we see in Shudesh different sizes of text. We see color, fonts, and really importantly, throughout Shudesh, I focus here on the masthead, is really this bright blood red that he uses. And so this is why you can say that Shudesh stands out against competitors from the 1950s that were largely in black and white, that would have boring visuals, is, right, not just the bright red that runs across the masthead, but this fury of swirling red. We can look, this is the first issue. I again want to sort of emphasize the extent of red, the size differential of the different types of font, and then the different sizes of the lettering that's used in red. And so as you can see from this particular image, you have nearly over 20% of the front page in red. You have an additional approximate 30% is taken up by a single image. This is probably the first issue. It's probably the worst sort of visual image out of what was otherwise an excellently maintained archive. But this visual is of a place in Iran on fire. And this appeal to fire, I'm going to talk about later on, but it's these types of visuals in conjunction with red that very much engages the sense of sight. And so I want to talk as we're going through it in terms of the color of red and its role as an effective attention gathering and memory, and its role in memory associations. It's part of the ensemble of aesthetic eye-catching choices that Shudesh uses, in addition to font style, size, placement, composition, content, that produces these types of visual images. And I will show you more sort of violent and shocking images momentarily. And what's important is that producers at the time had long used these rare colors, rare, vivid colors and vivid constructions and shocking representations to make an impact. And so color can both structure knowledge and affect ways of existing so as to be intellectually and socially significant in cultural poetics and the production of cultural narratives, histories of representation, social practice meanings, and regimes of power and knowledge. And I think largely we can say that Karimpour used red, the color red, for its ability to appeal to multiple diverse communities of Iran simultaneously. I've talked about the varieties of literacies in 1951 Iran, and this red is bright, it's vivid, and so it stands out, as I've mentioned, against its competitors. But what it does then is appeals to the number of consumers. One, first and foremost, it associates red with riot and revolution. Shudesh itself, I translate as uprising. It has a variety of translations one could use, but using the point of Shudesh, again, was to catalyze a revolution, to start with smaller riots that would lead to a revolution that would overturn the British imperialist and Iranian feudalist partnership. And so throughout in every page and almost every sentence of this newspaper, there are calls for sacrifice. And so this association of red, one, comes with blood and bloody riots and revolution. And it highlights the inflammatory revolutionary seeking text. But two, What it also does is it communicates support for anti-imperial communism that Karimpour had to suspend momentarily when Shudesh began publication. He himself had been part of the Tudeh party during the 1940s, and as many of you know, a number of Tudeh members left that party when there were accusations of subservience to the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, within a few issues after Shudesh gets banned in its 6th issue, you see the newspaper heralding and extolling the virtues of communism, the Red Army, and the actions of both China and the Soviet Union against Euro-America, and particularly the British embargo and attempt to control oil revenues. And so we see this association with red particularly, I found this fantastic in the sense that this really tells you about how Karimpour envisioned communism as the banner of union that very much supported Iran against imperialist capitalism. And here, and you don't need the text to really understand, particularly the image I'm talking about is the lower half of the first page here, where you have Mossadegh, who is supported by Yugoslavia and China. And what isn't sort of evident in the text is that the British had just lost at the ICJ. And so what you do see very clearly is somebody in a top hat leading away, right, the donkey, and it clearly with the flags of Turkey and the United States drawn overwards. The idea is that those countries and their governments were asses and they were unsuccessful against this union that is supporting Mossadegh and the Iranian people. And both of those are evident, particularly as you have the Soviet Union's flag flying on your right side there. And then this is also supported in the upper sort of immediate left, my left corner here. Along the way, you have support for anti-imperialism, anti-imperialist communism. The newspaper says that other Middle Eastern countries have learned from heroes that have made sacrifices like Mossadegh. And the image here is, of course, as indicated by the top hats, right? The Egyptians kicking out the British across the Nile, and that the Egyptian youth have also learned from all these experiences. And so this is, again, in supporting, right, the association of red and communism. The third way that Shudesh uses red to appeal is to Iran's diverse religious communities. And so I want to go back a second to this masthead. And as part of this, I will, in my analysis of red, in addition to the color of blood, it is on every page, the discussion of blood, the need to sacrifice blood. Karimpour very much extols and uses red, I think, to appeal to diverse religious communities, specifically Zoroastrianism and Judaism. And so when we look at the masthead here, Shudesh is in this sort of swirling fire. And this isn't sort of the normal font that we see elsewhere. It's not clear. It very much is this fury of fiery flames. And so here we see fires not only means to provoke or symbolize uprisings and revolutions, but is also the symbol of divine presence in both Zoroastrianism and Judaism. And so we can see the masthead as well as other places where this swirling font is used in a multifunctional way, so that the fire, along with an appeal, a textual appeal and knowledge of Iran's diverse religious communities, works to suggest an inclusivity for the revolution that Karimpour and his supporters were seeking. And also it expands, again, the consumer base for the newspaper, which was estimated and reported by Karimpour himself at over 34,000. That they sold, every issue was sold multiple times. They couldn't keep copies from Khuzestan up through Tehran. And if you consider that there were only 120,000 to 160,000 literate, 34,000 is a phenomenal number for Shudesh to be selling. And so the text, my point back to the appeal of these two religious communities is that we also have support from the text itself into this symbolistic appeal where Shudesh talks about and wants Mazda and talks about the divine light, as well as the discrimination that the Jewish communities have had and faced in Iran historically. The fourth way that Shudesh uses the color red is to represent the emotions of frustration, anger, and this visual that appeals to the multiple literacies of society is strengthened again by the text. Red, as I've been saying, is particularly associated with fire and image on the first issue, and it consistently repeats against in multiple issues. And so phenomenologically, it's salient responses to the ongoing crises that Iran was experiencing, from economic crises, food shortages, the political crisis of the governments, and what was happening with the UK. And so the combination of the color and the symbol of fire work as a palatable negative sign to further affect the emotions of the populace. And here, while we may wonder about the plausibility of that, then the importance of the text again comes into play, where you have this association between red and affectivity. And Shudesh on multiple occasions warns the government that if it continued to disregard the living conditions and quote, subjugated and the subjugated and destitute people's fire of anger and rage, end quote, would consume everything with quote, unprecedented heat and flames, burning both the innocent and the guilty. Shudesh went on to say that these flames would engulf the government unless it did something to address the people's feelings, especially those of the incensed youth. And Karimpour warned the opposition and what he called the co-conspirators that they should, quote, be afraid of the day when Iran's angry faces and racked nerves would become determined to kill. Certainly on that day, something other than the smoke of gunpowder, fire molten lead, and blood fused with the inflamed popular sentiment will rule the Majlis. With this multifaceted visual appeal to Iran's diverse communities and its multiple literacies, it's then able to engage its audiences through auditory appeals. As I mentioned, the approximate 1.1 to 1.6% literacy rate is what's pivotal to understanding what I make as the case for orality and orality. And to be clear, O-R-A-L-I-T-Y and A-U-R-A-L-I-T-Y. Again, mid-century Iran remained a sharing, hearing environment. And so this appeal to red visually to audiences and news hawkers in town squares would then enable those khandans and readers, formal and informal, to help perpetuate and catalyze increased sales, increased attention to Shudesh. And so as one by one, they would add up. And so from maidans and squares and town centers, you could have your elite and informal reading circles in which households, children, older individuals could overhear in a shared reading and speaking environment the message of Shudesh. And I think that is really some of its most infamous appeals come from this shared reading environment or the oral transmission of its message. And so from that, I would move into sort of this idea of Shudesh as the text that yells. And from the very beginning of the written text, we get from Karimpour, and he explains his emotional aggravation, his increasing destitution of the environment that was in Iran. And in Persian, there is a shortness. I will describe it, and then for non-Persian listeners, I'll read it in English. But there is a shortness to the words, the rhyme, and the rhythm. And so there is more urgency in the Persian to quote, get rid of the xenophiles, right? Again, the point is revolution. And so Kerimpour says from the very beginning, I yell, people do not let us in front of the free and living world be ashamed and humiliated. Rise, wake up, come with fervor, bravery, and selflessness for our freedom. We must expel the foreigners and eliminate the treasonous. The only way to free the Iranian nation from the claws of this blood-sucking ruling party is riot and revolution. I will say one more time with clarity, I'm going to scream and yell, people, if you are in search of Iran's happiness and prosperity, the only way, the only solution is through bloody riots and revolution. And he goes on extolling the need to yell, whether it's from the ICJ, whether it's from Iranian parliament approving and verifying legislation, nationalizing the oil industry. Shudesh explains all of it in terms of a political theology and a willingness to sacrifice for this ultimate revolution that he's seeking to do. And so one of the longest, and I'm sorry, it's going to be a little bit long, appeals to the auditory sense in this shared hearing and reading environment comes after the oil nationalization, where again, in a short staccato rhythm, in some places they get longer, but there is a punch to the Persian in which Shudesh explains the surprise of the British. And he says, still the pirates do not believe they have been defeated in such a disgraceful manner. Still the parasites by the Thames River do not accept. Iranian oil was nationalized, and this ancient 6,000-year-old country of ours has officially gained independence and freedom. The devious lords who have become accustomed to plundering and bloodletting, they still are not willing to even think that their grubby hands have been cut off from the black gold of Iran. The lords still think that the Iranian people, wherever they see a foreigner, will deeply bow with hand held to chest in front of His Excellency. The lords, ignorant of the East, still seeing the awakening of the Iranian people through the prism of the two ophthalmologists, Taheri and Abbas Masoudi, as well as 4 other sellouts and criminals, they think that they are dealing with the people of the South Persia Rifles period. Where is that obese lord who is clueless about everything? To the thunderous storm and the tumultuous sea of angry Iranian people, like an all-engulfing tidal wave, who have revolted to fulfill their rights. And just like an angry lion screamed, I am right. Where is that crazy British Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs to see the angry, violent sea of avenging Iranian youth with their blood-filled propacetic eyes? And so for every line that we see, it is full of violence. It is about the anti-imperial movement, but all of it is through these appeals to sounds and sight for Shudesh and for Kerimpour. And so I think in conclusion, what I want to largely argue is this very much overlooked archive, this newspaper that has been largely seen as a bit of political hackery. Really, one makes 2 very large contributions, I think, to mid-century Iranian cultural production. One within the sacrificial discourse that was transmitted across the political and religious arenas inside of Iran, as well as for these 2 engaged and intertwined multisensory appeals to multiple literacies and diverse communities of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nida. That was very fascinating. So we'll leave the questions, of course, for later. We'll move on to our 3rd speaker, Shada, please. Please start.
Yes, thank you, Yas. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I would also like to thank NYU ISI for organizing the event and the editors, Mehdi Khorrami and Amir Mousavi, for all their work on the book. It's a pleasure to be part of both. So I wrote this chapter with 3 questions in mind and with attention to pain and pleasure in Iranian, Indian, and European contexts. The central question, which is also the focus of my talk today, was to understand the perseverance and the recurrence of Muharram ceremonies that revolve around the infliction of physical and psychological pain for at least 11 centuries in Iran. These mourning traditions, as we know them today, include chest beating and chain beating, the Azeri ritual of Shakhsi Vakhsi, or in Persian, Shah Hossein Guyan, occasional bloodletting, and of course, the Taziyeh passion plays, which involve scenes of torture of children and adults, decapitation, flogging, amputation, and the setting of tents on fire. So my goal was to understand why members of various ethnic groups, languages, and currently nationalities within the span of centuries would continue to perform, watch, and participate in deliberate, repetitive, and repeating acts of physical and affective suffering. The interactions between the audience and the performers of Muharram ceremonies and the exchanges of pain and pleasure offered significant insight. This is, of course, not to minimize the role of faith. The audience's religious belief is the very element that allows it to identify with the characters, and I can expand on that during the Q&A if there is any interest. But to put it briefly, previous scholarship has aptly established that in its genesis, Taziyeh revolved around the faith and the religious sentiments of the performers and the audience. Nonetheless, the scholarship has less convincingly asserted a cause and effect relationship between faith and audience interaction, suggesting that the audience participates in the drama and responds to it chiefly due to religious beliefs. I argue that to understand what brings the audience to Taziyeh, we need to understand audience interaction with actors as actors and not just as characters that represent religious and anti-religious figures. Today, I'm going to focus on the psychosocial dimensions of my discussion with the premise that Shi'ism, both as a religious faith and as a political doctrine, was born out of a major historical trauma, according to Hamid Dabashi, and has been imbued with a cult of suffering and martyrdom since its inception, according to Abbas Amanat. And both of these were direct quotes. The political traumas in the history of Shi'ism range from betrayal and assassination of Imam Ali and the events and stories of Karbala in early Islamic history to the 15th century battlefield deaths of the Shi'is, including Shah Ismail's family members who were fighting for religious authority and political power with crusade-like campaigns against the Christians in the Caucasus. And I would refer you to Amanat's Iran, a Modern History for more on that. Thus, and this is an important point in this discussion, Shi'ism has historically developed with its ideal political leaders not in power. In the modern period, immediate examples are the overthrow of Mossadegh's highly popular government by the CIA coup of 1953 and the protests following the 2009 presidential elections, which not accidentally have made widespread use of Ashura symbols and analogies. I'm sure you can also relate back to Nida's presentation right now. The centrality of the trauma of Karbala to Shi'i cultural and political life is described in Dabashi's concept of Karbala complex, and so is the centrality of the body to Muharram ceremonies. What I strive to do in this chapter was understanding the process of trauma, the commemoration of trauma, and the need behind the return to processing trauma with grassroots, voluntary, and widespread audience participation, regardless of era and political leadership. Aristotle's concept of catharsis and Lacan's theory of jouissance, itself based on Freud's death instincts and beyond the pleasure principle, proved very helpful in understanding the sensory experiences of pain and pleasure in a larger context and the return to the Muharram ceremonies in Iran. The significance of the body to Muharram ceremonies corroborates the argument that the audience interaction in these ceremonies revolves around exchanging sensations of intermingled guilt, pain, and pleasure. The exchanges of guilt and pain in the Muharram ceremonies result in pleasure for the performers and relief of guilt for the audience. As actors, the performers target the sadness that the audience feels for the saints and the guilt by association that they feel from the act of the villains. The performers turn the sadness and guilt into pain, and therefore they process the pain for the audience. They act, enact, and reenact as saints in pain and as villains in sin. The audience imagines how that pain torments the body and spirit of the saint, receives the pain, and experiences it by way of identification. So the audience is now in pain. It feels it and cries or expresses sadness and anger. The performers register that as successful reception of the reenacted pain, and that gives them pleasure. Actually, one of the Taziyeh performers that I interviewed in Iran said to me that as soon as the audience starts crying, they say amongst themselves that kar gereft, or it's working, or we're in business, something like that. So that's pleasure for the performers. Both in Taziyeh and in chest beating and chain beating ceremonies, the infliction of pain on the bodies of the participants, whether in performing or in spectating roles, is believed to purify the participant's soul directly through reenacting self-beating or crying and vicariously by way of standing witness. There are unmistakable resemblances between the effects of Taziyeh and Muharram ceremonies and the concept of catharsis in Aristotle's Poetics and Politics. Aristotle thought that the calming effects of catharsis bring pleasure to the spectators and balance their emotions. The Greek word purgation, or as Lacan believed, ceremonial and ritual purification, can mean religious cleansing of the spirit as well as medical cleansing of the body. For Lacan, Aristotelian catharsis means the purgation of the emotions of fear and pity and is the aim of tragedy. When tragedy is remembered with music, as it is in Taziyeh, chest beating, chain beating, shakhsi-wakhsi, and bloodletting, the participants enter states that are described by Persian language scholars as trance, inculcation, melancholia, and possession. In Persian, khalse, talqin, shedai, shiftagi. These conditions parallel the descriptions in politics of physical catharsis in the ancient Greek rituals. Of all the relevant commentaries, Lacan's concept of jouissance seems to offer the most widely applicable analysis of painful pleasure. While there is no single definition of jouissance as pertaining to this discussion, it entails pleasure from suffering of loss, and pleasure from repeated retrievals of loss. One example is the pride and glory of a Spartan mother after her son gets killed in the field of honor. And in contemporary psychoanalysis, jouissance is considered a necessary component of every individual's life in the attainment of psychic balance. Consequently, it is not a symptom and it cannot be cured. All human beings have a certain degree of jouissance that makes them derive pleasure from pain as a way of handling trauma. But individuals with high jouissance, who typically experience more trauma and pain during their lives, create life situations that repeat a permanent search for suffering. And although that interferes with their happiness, it is necessary for their psychic balance because it reinforces their essential need for survival from trauma, and it reassures them of their ability to survive. In the environment of society and community, Taziyeh and other Muharram ceremonies can be interpreted as expressions of social jouissance. Mystic jouissance, initially identified in religious Catholic figures, involves heroes and heroines driven to heroic acts that will necessarily lead them to dying for their ideals. There is no psychopathology inferred by Lacan in mystic jouissance. The paradox of heroism in mystic jouissance involves pleasure in suffering for individual and communal ideals. In the Karbala narrative, the delight is not in suffering per se, but in suffering for one's idealism and heroism. And I could get into the differences between sadism and masochism. This is something I deal with in the chapter. Imam Hussein, his followers throughout the centuries, and the audience of his theater suffered knowingly and rebel with passion for the ideal social and political environment. According to Amanat, in the second part of the 15th century, the Safavi Sufi fighters were deemed by their devotees as saints who had been martyred for a divine cause. This phrase was a quote. As the dialectics of Taziyah and jouissance unfold, it becomes clear that the passion and aggression that make individuals rebel and die for their ideals speak to the acceptance of death for the sake of life, either to preserve or to ameliorate life. The Spartan mother shares the jouissance of the Christian mother of Wahab, who proudly throws the decapitated head of her son back at the army of Yazid in the Taziyah of Wahab, and announces that she will not take back a head that she has given for the path of Imam Hussein. With regard to this discussion, the most important factor about the logic of jouissance and its repetition is that the anxiety that is produced by unpleasure is repeated with the knowledge that the unpleasure can be overcome. This concept was formerly instigated by Freud as the satisfaction that a child receives from a repetitive game of Fort Da, going from an overpowering passive situation to taking an active part by way of repeating the situation with the aim of domination and control. Yves Hendrick revised this thesis into the instinct to master and control one's environment and adjusting the environment to oneself. The pleasure then comes from the individual's ability to alter action through repetitive, practiced activity, such as learning to master space. Like the death instincts and beyond the pleasure principle, jouissance is a way of surviving early trauma by incorporating suffering into the constitution of the psyche during its individual and environmental development. With attention to early trauma in the history of Shiism, I am expanding the concept of mystic jouissance to the social and political levels to argue that the annual Muharram ceremonies in general and the communal theater of Taziyah in particular reflect the political trauma and the social anxieties of Shi'i Iran, as well as society's need for surviving ongoing trauma and accepting death. Collective trauma at its core calls for collective awareness and response. In contemporary Iranian society, the secular awareness of collective trauma has been encapsulated as shared pain or dard mushtarak in Ahmad Shamlou's poetry. Historically, Iranian society's response to collective trauma has manifested itself religiously in the communal ceremonies that mourn the loss of heroes, condemn oppression, and operate as a mechanism for accepting death. As much as they are a response to the historical trauma in Shiism, the contemporary ceremonies vocalize the socio-political anxieties of a nation overpowered by unemployment, political suppression, international isolation, domestic turmoil, and being on the verge of economic collapse. Muharram ceremonies are essentially an expression of mastering space and controlling one's environment. On a larger scale, the ceremonies allow the participants to assume an active role in a passive social situation that overpowers them. They also enable the citizens to partake in a political atmosphere over which they have no control. the infliction of pain on the body, from which the performers know that they will recover, the exchanges of pain and pleasure with the audience, and the vehement production of sound are statements of control to the self, the neighbors, and the restrictors of environment. Based on Hendrix's theory, environmental influences include frustration, education, discipline, and especially the individual tolerance of parents and nurses. The message is as much to one's regional and international Sunni, non-Muslim, and secular neighbors as it is to the Shi'i lawmakers, law enforcers, and other infantilizing entities of the state that have claimed themselves as guardians who must parent, guide, discipline their subjects. Muharram ceremonies also signal messages of controlling public space to one's Shi'i neighbors, particularly to those in near distances. Extreme rivalry between neighborhoods in holding Muharram ceremonies has had economic, guild-based, tribal, and political roots. In his writing on Yazd, the anthropogeographer Muhammad Hossein Papoli Yazdi confirms that the chest-beating troops of different neighborhoods in effect represented socioeconomic and political rivalries. Freud and Lacan also found the love of one's neighbor as oneself contradictory to human instincts and drives. From there, Lacan theorized that the common person's aspiration to happiness leads to his or her rebellion against love of one's neighbor and ultimately to the death of God. This he defined as the paradox of jouissance in the dialectic of happiness, a source of both inner disappointment and secret demand for pleasure. The social anxieties of modern Iran that manifest themselves in the mourning ceremonies are rooted as much in political unrest as they are in Shi'i history. Social and political anxieties are reflected with the language of injustice, inequity, and oppression in ta'ziyeh dialogues and lamentation songs, their popularity and the frequency of their performances in a given period. The ta'ziyeh of Qaniya of Farang resonated with the politically and religiously repressive atmosphere of the Pahlavi era. The play is about a Shi'i couple and their companions who are jailed by the European king Qaniya for holding Muharram ceremonies in a European city. The king is European, like the westernized Pahlavi kings and statesmen who were deemed foreign agents when opposing the ulama. Christianity is the religion of the Anglo-Russian invaders who had occupied Iran from 1941 to 1946. In a 1950 to 51 published version of Qaniya of Farang, the character of the Shi'i woman and the Shi'i man speak of the prison as a flower garden, then plead to Imam Hussein to see the state of prisoners, and they wish their lives to be sacrificed for him in Europe. In today's ta'ziyeh, references to unemployment, economic inflation, and class discrimination are customary through direct address of the audience by one of the protagonists, at times simultaneously with the purpose of receiving prayers and tips. There is a certain type of pleasure in Muharram ceremonies to which one returns. Ta'ziyeh, public lamentation, chest beating, and chain beating, themselves praxis that may not seem pleasurable, come with the cathartic pleasure of honing one's emotional capacity to endure pain. Lacan followed jouissance with a discussion on catharsis in its Aristotelian sense in poetics. Aristotle believed that the pleasure of tragedy is derived from the purgation or catharsis of passions of fear and pity. In Aristotle's philosophy, it is not pity or fear themselves that get purified. Rather, according to D.W. Lucas, what is purified is the emotional capacity of the spectator over a considerable period of time after the performance. What purifies is the emotional experience given by the performance itself. The Muharram ceremonies refine the individual and the communal capacity to process personal and collective trauma. In addition to crying and lamenting, catharsis in the Muharram ceremonies comes from the repetition of movements and sounds. The procession rites, the ecstatic meter produced by the beating of chests and chains, and the rhythmic gallops of horses and the paced trudges of camels that circle the performance space of Taziyeh to the music of drums and cymbals. They bring to mind Lacan's analysis of pleasure in his critique of Dionysian frenzy and the return to the pleasure of catharsis after a crisis that itself threatens pleasure. In ceremonies that emulate pain and death from injustice, the cathartic relief and the increase of emotional capacity to endure pain and process trauma is what brings the participants back to deliberate, repetitive, and repeating acts of physical and affective suffering. And as in any repetitive tendency, the repeated experiences are as painful as they are pleasant. So to wrap up, the participants return to the theater of Taziyeh and continue with mourning ceremonies because of the jouissance of exchanging guilt, pain, and pleasure, cathartic relief from pain, feeling control, and increasing their capacity for individual and collective trauma. The satisfaction that the performers derive from the crying of the audience indicates successful exchanges of pain and pleasure, itself a testimony that religious motivations alone cannot explain participation in the Muharram ceremonies. The fear of sacrilege and the phenomenon of beating up the actors, the anti-religious characters, are just as much testimonies to the power of acting and the believability of theatrics in Taziyeh as they are to religious beliefs. The beating up of actors speaks to the exchanges of emotional, psychological, and physical pain due to the direct experience of pain on the audience's body. The presence of religious beliefs is an assumption. The beating of the body is a fact. The core religious belief in the Muharram ceremonies is the promise for salvation. To make the body and the mind suffer is to receive pain in exchange for promised pleasure. Had Lacan looked beyond the Judeo-Christian tradition, he may have reconsidered stating that, quote, only Christianity through the drama of the Passion gives full content to the naturalness of the truth we have called the death of God, unquote. In Taziyeh and other Muharram ceremonies that highlight historical injustice, the Shi'is use sound, sight, rhythm, and touch to communicate their control of the environment to their Shi'i and non-Shi'i neighbors in adjacent classes, regions, and belief systems. The passion of the reenactor exposes the voluntary and involuntary receivers to the pain that the reenactors undertake, the pain that a troublesome neighbor could undertake, and the pleasure that the participants elicit from both pains. The message is loud and clear and heartily about God. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shada Jan. It's very interesting talk. All right, I think it's we can now open the floor to questions.
I could probably respond to Mr. Farhang's comment about the role of Ayatollah Kashani and Ayatollah Burujerdi in the coup. Yes, so my goal for mentioning the coup was to point out the trauma, the social trauma. I'm not saying that the coup was only done by the CIA. Of course, the Brits had as much a role in it, and so did the people on the street. The point was to mention the trauma that the Iranian society has been going through over and over.
Shada, maybe you might want to look at the last question asked by Nigar Motahedeh, which I think could be a useful thing to address.
Thanks, Nagar. That's a good point. The question is, how does identification work in the catharsis? So basically, when the audience identifies with the characters or with the actors, or goes there based on religious beliefs, goes there prepared to identify, and sees that the actor is getting shot or amputated or flogged, or some torture is being done without actually dying. The acting is often so powerful that allows the audience to put themselves in place of someone receiving that pain. And as in someone who has just been shot, who might not feel much sense, the audience usually feels that. I mean, I certainly was under that impression when I attended some Tazia performances. Another thing which is not through identification, but through the rhythmic music, and also through the chest beating and chain beating, usually chest beating during Tazia. In the Tazia performance itself, chain beating is not very common, but chest beating is very common. After a while, even if you're not beating your chest, you are going to enter some state of catharsis.
I have one question for the panel, and it's about the idea of the body in these ceremonies. I mean, the person in Amir's discussion, the soldier, the body of the soldier; in Shada's discussion, the body of the chest beater. These people, in Nida's discussion, the literate and illiterate, people who read and supposed to do shuresh. Who are they? I mean, are they, you know, the leaders are usually, or the writers are the ones that call others to shuresh or to chest beating or to, you know, to war, are very different from the body who is there and being under the influence of, you know, the pain, the pressure, the pleasure, the screaming, the blood. Do you think that it's very interesting how the audience and the actors are different from the ones who manage it, I think? Like Shada, for example, what I'm trying to say is that, you know, in Iran, you know, the chest beaters and the people who walk on the streets and, you know, chant for Muharram are very different from the mullahs, the clergy, who never do that. They never really hit themselves hard. They are the ones who encourage, but they are on the side. The audience and the actors, of course, there's this mutual give and take of pain and pleasure, but the ones who manage it are different. And so it makes it very interesting. There's that disconnect between the person who organizes it, leads it, encourages it, or invests money in it, like the merchant class.
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking this, because I try to deal with this in the chapter. And my argument is that political glorification of a matter does not substantially change the matter itself. And so that the Iranian state has used Muharram ceremonies in constructing its religious national identity, of course, it has left a bitter taste and turned many away. On the other hand, the current immediacy of Muharram rites among millions of people was, as you can all testify, reaffirmed by the widespread use of Ashura symbols in the protests against the results of the 2009 elections. Now, another thing is that the utilization of religious rites in 4 decades has had a minuscule impact compared to the function and meaning that those rites have developed within at least 11 centuries. And so the adoption of Ashura narrative by the Islamic Republic, or its ordering by the people who might benefit from it, is not very different from the propagandization of popular Shiism by the Safavid and Qajar dynasties and the use of Muharram ceremonies between 1770s and 1920s. And in the same way, the Pahlavi state's uses and abuses of the Achaemenid past and the Shahnameh industry have left their mark on how the two are currently understood and turned into cultural sensations, but they have not altered the history of the Achaemenid Empire or the content of Shahnameh. So the use of ceremonies or histories for propaganda doesn't necessarily alter the practice itself.
So I think you're right. It just the question is that the Shahnameh or the Achaemenid, it's this idea of inflicting pain on your body physically. I think there's a difference. There's propaganda, and then there is literal physical feeling of pain, or in Amir's case, the blood, the soldiers who die. And so it makes it more tangible, concrete, and urgent to think, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, particularly for Shudesh, that's the purpose, right? You talked about the gap between the non-state actor and the society, and Karimpour, we can see through the engagement of sight and sound that he's trying to close that gap as a political activist who used to give speeches in southern Tehran for the Tudeh party. When you have the proliferation of text, he's still trying to mobilize that same appeal that he would give as a speech. And so first, I think in attempting to close that gap and appeal to multiple literacies, there is this appeal to sight. And then because of the shared hearing environment, then that yelling can happen, right? That he would, rather than being on the platform, speaking to throngs of people in southern Tehran, he now has the text and that are being read by khandans and by those informal reading circles and formal reading circles in households. And so the purpose is to affect the body, right? It's very clear from the text, from the headlines, from the engagement of the site and the yelling, that Karimpour wants an impact on a broader society, because only 120 to 160,000 people can read. And that's not going to make a revolution against imperialism and feudalism. That's not going to have an impact. So he has to go broad, he has to go wide. And that's how we get it through print capitalism. And that's the reason why he calls the Shah's brother Atullah Sag, and he calls his sisters a variety of different words, basically, and engages in libel and slander, and to compound the impact of the red, there is this textual yelling that is aimed at creating and catalyzing riots that will hopefully gain enough momentum. And so to your question, I think at least for my chapter, I talk about it extensively, that it is to make an impact, that it is to have an affect on the body, so much so that Iranians understand the desperate situation. They feel the desperateness of the conditions in which they're living, and they know that they're not by themselves. And then that way, through this multisensory appeal, it's an impact on the body to then go march. And then ultimately sacrifice with Fedakari. And there is the constant use of that phrase throughout the archive.
Thank you so much, Nida. Thank you, Shada.
There's two more questions. I believe there's a question from Dr. Manoukian. I'm going to read the question so the audience knows it. My understanding is that at least in some Taziyah forms, the performers do not impersonate characters, but perform their distance from them. If this is so, how is the audience performs, or how is the audience performers relationship transformed? Yes, a very good point indeed. The point actually, or the idea behind it, is that the performers wouldn't impersonate too closely because that would be sacrilegious. And in many instances, that distance is kept. And so the audience is usually there for the theater, for the entertainment aspect of it, if not just for the cathartic aspect of it. So that just creates a relationship between the audience and the performers as an entertaining relationship, or someone who is there to bring in a communal religious act for the community. And of course, at least nowadays, they're not necessarily from the same community. Tazieh troops circle around the country. So it's not like they have a previous relationship like they used to 30 or 40, 50 years ago. And partly it's seen as a religious act, and partly is seen as entertainment. But again, it's not always the fact that they can maintain the distance. See, theater does its own thing. I mean, yes, you can have the idea in mind of not getting too religiously close to the characters, but my whole point and the reason for this chapter is that theater takes over. And in fact, most of the Tazieh performers I spoke to were very clear on the fact, on saying that theater is 100, Tazieh is 100% theater. They don't deny that.
Well, thank you, Amir. Thank you, Nida, and thank you, Shada. This was an amazing, amazing session, and I learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience did as well. We enjoyed it. We learned a lot, and this is going to make us think, and that's what's important. I just want to thank you and thank Kevorkian again for sponsoring this session, and for the audience who wants to stay and continue discussion, by all means do. We're here, and hopefully Amir, Shada, and Nida, you can stay as well, and we could continue the discussion. Thank you and goodbye.